There are of course critics of evolution. One such outspoken critic is Professor John Corrigan Jonathan Wells, born 1942, who is an American molecular biologist, author, and intelligent design advocate. He is quite open about his religious background, and his long-standing commitment to destroy Darwinism. But whatever his background, do his arguments hold up? He has strongly criticized mainstream educational systems for citing many examples of evolution theory as fact, in textbooks, when in reality, they are either inconclusive or in many cases have been proven wrong, and in some cases fraudulent. Despite this, these examples have persisted in the classrooms, and have been presented as scientific truths. This is utterly astounding. He says, according to Darwin's theory, however, the whole history of life is the outcome of random variations and survival of the fittest. Although some features of living organisms, such as eyes, appear to be designed, Darwin claimed that this is only an illusion. Living things are the result of an essentially directionless process, and we are merely the accidental byproduct of blind natural forces, which did not have us in mind. When I finished my Yale PhD, I felt confident that I understood the theological basis of the conflict between Darwinism and theism. But Darwinism was clearly winning the ideological battle in the universities, the public schools, and the mass media, largely because it claimed to be supported by scientific evidence. I knew enough about biology to know that this claim was quite shaky, but few scientists were willing to challenge it. Those who did were often lumped together with young earth biblical fundamentalists, and thereby discredited in the eyes of most scholars. I eventually decided to join the fray by returning to graduate school in biology. I was convinced that embryology is the Achilles heel of Darwinism. One cannot understand how organisms evolve, unless one understands how they develop. In 1989, I entered a second PhD program, this time in biology, at the University of California at Berkeley. While there, I studied embryology and evolution. Wells has taught embryology at a state college, and at the time of this writing, a postdoctoral research biologist at Berkeley, writing articles critical of Darwinism. He is among a growing number of highly educated and eloquent critics of the Darwinian paradigm. Embryologists, paleontologists, biochemists, molecular biologists, medical doctors, philosophers, and lawyers, are all part of this group, critical of Darwinism, and they are growing in number. Unfortunately, the North American science and religion establishment has largely turned a deaf ear to these critics, preferring instead to abandon classical theology and embrace metaphysical materialism, and moral relativism. According to Wells, a small, powerful elite controls all the official information outlets while the evidence against the official position swells quietly, like a wave building offshore. Someday soon, to the surprise of many people in academia and the media, the wave will break. I predict that the Darwinist establishment will come apart at the seams. So how much of the Darwinian evolution teaching is based on actual conclusive science, and how much of this teaching is only based on inconclusive faith and imagination, perhaps in a similar way to religion, such as the teaching of spontaneous generation of life, global common ancestry, and all of it having no intelligent creator as its cause, but only natural processes everywhere in the said process. What sort of evidence are we relying on to support such ideas? How reproducible is it in the laboratory? Simply put, most of it is not. And that is being charitable. Professor Jonathan Wells wrote about 10 icons of this evolution teaching in his book. He says he could have written about more, but he says that he had to stop somewhere. These false teachings are taught as being facts to many students. Firstly, the 1953 Urey experiment, that purported to show that life could have begun spontaneously on the early Earth. He said that this was still found in most biology textbooks, even though geochemists decided, decades ago, that the experiment was unrealistic, and really doesn't say anything substantial about the origin of life. The second icon was Darwin's Tree of Life, The branching pattern that would show how all organisms descended from a common ancestor at the root. This was a theoretical statement, but it's presented in most biology textbooks as though it were a fact. The fossil evidence, for example, does not show this branching pattern. When you look at the major groups of animals, they appear pretty much at the same time, rather than diverging from a common ancestor. The third icon he wrote about was homology in invertebrate limbs. If you look at the bone structure of the human hand, or the human arm, and you compare that to a whale's flipper, or a bird's wing, or a bat's wing, there are certain striking similarities in the bone structure, and Darwin considered this to be a result of common descent. But people before Darwin noticed this also, but they attributed this to a common designer. The truth is, it could be either one. The bone structure itself doesn't tell us. The fourth icon is Haeckel's embryo drawings, which purported to show that vertebrates are similar to early embryos, and there provides evidence for common ancestry. But in fact, the embryos are not similar, and Haeckel faked the drawings. The fifth icon that he wrote about was Archaeopteryx, a famous fossil bird that had a long tail and teeth in its beak like reptiles, and for a long time was thought to be the missing link between reptiles and birds. Biologists no longer think that, because there are too many differences between Archaeopteryx and modern birds, but textbooks tend to present it as the missing link anyway. The peppered moth was a famous icon of evolution. Moths supposedly changed color during the Industrial Revolution because dark moths were better camouflage on soot-darkened tree trunks, and the birds couldn't see them, so they ate the light moths and left the dark ones. And this is still used in many textbooks as a classic example of natural selection, when in fact biologists discovered in the 1980s that peppered moths don't normally rest on tree trunks in the wild at all. And so, the textbook pictures have all been staged and the story has serious flaws. Darwin's finches, another icon of evolution, are some species of birds on the Galapagos Islands, that are very similar except for the size and shape of their beaks. And it is thought that they evolved from a common ancestor, because of having to eat different foods on the different islands, and it's quite possible. But the actual evidence shows us only that the beaks can change over a matter of years based on climate and diet. But the changes are temporary, they oscillate back and forth, and don't go anywhere. So, as evidence for the origin of species, Darwin's finches don't work. Another icon of evolution is the four-winged fruit fly. Most fruit flies have two wings, but a series of mutations can cause a fly to develop a second set of wings, very normal looking, but in fact, there are no muscles attached to it, so the second set of wings is effectively dead. The fly is a hopeless cripple. It's kind of like having a small plane with an extra pair of wings tied to its tail. This is not the forerunner of a new race of insects, but an evolutionary dead end. The last two icons that Wells wrote about in his book were fossil horses and the ape-to-human picture. In both cases, there is some real evidence here. He says that the important point in both of these icons is that a very heavy dose of philosophy is laid on the evidence in each case, mainly to persuade students that evolution is without direction or purpose. In the case of the ape-to-human icons, we are told that humans are nothing more than animals. Neither one of those claims comes from the evidence. Those are philosophical claims, but they use the evidence to make themselves appear more scientific than what they really are. When looking at the fossil record, in the Cambrian, we can see animals that look like modern arthropods in their body plan, just like modern vertebrates, and modern mollusks, worms, and echinoderms, which include the starfish. When we watch them develop today, we have no reason to think that similar animals in the Cambrian didn't develop the same way. That's why the Cambrian fossils are recognizable in most cases as members of modern animal phyla. So, the complexity is already there, full-blown, right from the start. And if the complexity is there, then The complexity of development is also there because, presumably, these animals all developed from a single fertilized egg. And so, the processes we see now, we can legitimately extrapolate back to the Cambrian. Before the Cambrian, the forms of animal life were far simpler than in the Cambrian. So, the genetic materials to support life in the Cambrian had to appear rather suddenly. It was an explosion of genetic information, and very real. Inexplicable on Darwinian terms. But there was also an explosion of information of another sort, and that is the information that gets us body plans. The body plan, as far as we know, is not in DNA. For example, we know a lot of genes that play roles in development, which are very similar in fruit flies and humans. And yet fruit flies and humans have totally different body plans. It turns out that those genes, the most impressive ones, the most dramatic ones, are active fairly late in embryo development, long after the body plan is established. So, whatever is establishing the body plan, it's something else. And there obviously had to be an explosion of body plans as well as an explosion of DNA information. Certainly, DNA is essential. You cannot get an animal without the proper DNA, but developmental biologists know that there is a lot more to development than the DNA. We sometimes hear the notion of a genetic program, where the DNA is the blueprint for the organism. That is quite a common image, but in fact, we know that there is a lot of information for development that is not in the DNA. So properly speaking, the DNA is not the whole blueprint. It's more like a parts list. The DNA provides the animal body with proteins. And RNA is another chemical continuance. The DNA does not dictate the form of the animal, as far as we know. A house is another good analogy for the way DNA functions in the cell. The DNA is like a parts list. You could create 10 different piles of building materials, all of them identical, all of them with lots of lumber and piping and wiring and nails and roofing and cement and so on, the same thing in each pile, and give a different pile to a different person, and send them off where they can't see each other and say, "Okay, build me a house." And the odds that any two of those houses would look the same are very slim, because, with the same kinds of material, you can build all kinds of structures, and it's the same with the cell. The DNA provides the building materials or the list of building materials, but the cell decides the floor plan. The floor plan is somewhere else because to build a house you just can't have the building materials, you need also assembly instructions to do things in a certain order. If you build the roof first, you are in big trouble. You have to put the foundation in, the walls, the piping, the wiring. You need a certain sequence here, and you need a floor plan to know how to lay out the floor and the walls to begin with, and where to put the windows, and the DNA gives us the list of parts, but the rest, for the most part, certainly the floor plan is somewhere else. We've known all along that most mutations are either harmful or neutral. Neutral, meaning they don't have any noticeable effect, at least not right away. But really, beneficial mutations, which would be the only kind that evolution could use anyway, are extremely rare. Furthermore, they are biochemical in nature. For example, in antibiotic resistance. We know mutations can lead to antibiotic resistance, and those bacteria can survive in the presence of streptomycin, where others could not. But the bacteria that survive are still the same species of bacteria. Still tuberculosis, for example. So even the rare beneficial mutations we find, do not really transform the organism. They make minor changes within existing species which have never been controversial. And of course, the evidence for mutations has already suggested that to us. Fruit fly embryos have been taken and the DNA mutated in every possible way, and there are only 3 possible outcomes. 1. A normal fruit fly. 2. A defective fruit fly. 3. A dead fruit fly. And that's it. You can't even change the species, much less get a horsefly or a horse or something like that. What evidence have we found? We've certainly found a lot of evidence, but for what? Darwin's theory is that all living things descended from a common ancestor, modified by unguided natural processes, such as natural selection and variation. Darwin didn't write a book called How Existing Species Change Over Time. That's not even relevant. People have known that for centuries. So minor changes within existing species are not the issue here, and yet when Darwinists say that there is overwhelming evidence for Darwin's theory, 90% of what they talk about is minor changes within existing species. That's not the point at all. The point is, the origin of new species by this same process. And no one has ever observed the origin of a new species through variation and selection. And they've tried many times. But that key element in Darwin's theory, the origin of a new species, which is in the title of his book, has never been solved. The argument for common ancestry is usually based on similarities and differences. One animal might have certain similarities to another animal and certain dissimilarities. Those arguments are interesting, but they are not conclusive, because you can argue the same way on the basis of common design. I look like this and not like that because there is a design reason for that. You can do the same with cars. In fact, Darwin used car models as an illustration of descent with modification, but cars are designed, they are created by engineers. So, until you get this one important step where one species can originate from another species, why should we accept common ancestry at all? The mechanism is not there. The similarities and differences can cut either way, but what we are totally lacking at this point is good evidence for Darwin's basic mechanism. At the Discovery website, Wells responded to the rebuttals of his book by annoyed evolutionists. He also says that if Darwin knew there was no such thing as a simple cell, or the information bases of living organisms and how DNA works, one might think that Darwin would have never published and would have been laughed at in the scientific world. So, Jonathan Wells remains very critical of such a belief. But what if you are thinking that this person has an axe to grind because of his religious predisposition? Does that a priori commitment interfere with his objectivity as a scientist? Not that it should matter what anyone's ideologies are, only their arguments and the related evidence. However, it's worth asking other qualified people who are not religious, but have doubts about the Darwinian hypotheses. Yes, there are plenty. Consider the following example. David Berlinski, who was born in 1942, is an American author who describes himself as a secular Jew, yet even he is an academic who opposes the scientific consensus on the theory of evolution. Even though he is not a religious person, he has decided to be a senior person at an ID advocate organization called the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. He was a research assistant in molecular biology at Columbia University and a fellow researcher at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, IISA, in Austria and the Institut des Hautes Études Scientifiques, IHES, in France. He has written books on system analysis, mathematics, and much more, some of which have been recommended reading for some professors. He refrains from theorizing about the origin of life. Berlinski describes his attitude towards the ID movement as a warm but distant one. It's the same attitude that I display in public toward my ex-wives, he says, and also makes it clear that he is an agnostic. Even though he is a professed doubter of Darwinian concepts, he's always quick to point out that he has no particular agenda beyond skepticism. But objectively speaking, all that ad hominem stuff is quite superfluous. Therefore, what, according to Berlinski, are the things about evolution that make a non-religious person, or any free-thinking person objectively skeptical? There are many reasons. For one thing, he says, dogs stay dogs and bacteria stay bugs. Why? He says that it's
tough to say because we're not dealing with a theory in any sense in which, say, a physicist would recognize the theory. We're dealing with a collection of anecdotes, a certain point of view, a series of hunches. I would say that the most outstanding, the salient points are, first of all, the fossil record, which is simply mystifying. We can't make much sense of the fossil record. It does not sustain any kind of Darwinian prediction that can be intelligently derived from Darwinian theory, and it doesn't seem to sustain anything else as far as I can see. It's a perfectly mystifying record. That's one obvious point. I'm not talking just about the Cambrian explosion. I'm talking about everything that doesn't make a whole lot of sense in the fossil record. Second point, we have never been able in any way theoretically to examine the central Darwinian claim that natural selection and random variation can account for a great deal of complexity. If you look at the history of physics, for example, what did Newton do in the 17th century? He said, well, the planets are being attracted to the sun by a force. It's not any kind of force, it's a inverse square force. And then he went and showed that if you make that assumption, the result will be an orbit that conforms exactly to the observed orbit, say, of the Earth or of Mars. It will be a conic section. And then he proved the converse, that if it's a conic section, the planets must be attracted to a central source by an inverse square law. There is nothing like that in biology, in Darwinian theory. A kind of a canonical demonstration that this mechanism, random variation, natural selection, is adequate to the generation of this level of complexity. From the point of view of the serious sciences, without that kind of a demonstration, one is completely adrift. You have no idea whether the mechanism is adequate for its intended purposes. This is the second point. Third evidential piece of the puzzle. Look, you turn to the serious sciences, you turn to general relativity or quantum mechanics. I can program a computer with the equations of general relativity or with the equations of quantum mechanics, and I can say, all right, what are the consequences? I can actually see the consequences emerge in a simulation. We can't do any of this in biology. And that should prompt any reasonable person to ask, why not? If this is such a simple mechanism, which could easily be programmed on a computer, how come we can't set up a computer and create something of biological-like complexity? How come we cannot see the unfolding of an evolutionary process the way we can see the unfolding of an evolutionary process in physics? This is a very serious question. I've looked at all the genetic algorithms. I'm trying to write a genetic algorithm myself. And the sheer fact is, without a tremendous amount of very special manipulation and ad hoc constraints, the computer is not going to generate anything realistic if it uses Darwinian mechanisms, and it will generate something realistic only if it doesn't use Darwinian mechanisms. This is an important point. 50 years after the computer revolution began, we have a splendid tool for assessing the intelligibility and viability of Darwinian theory. And everything that we know, and I think this is the uniform experience of anyone working in genetic algorithms, indicates these mechanisms will not work. They will not work for their intended purposes. And finally, there's the utter absence of laboratory evidence. I mean, random variation, natural selection, we should be able to start manipulating organisms. When we look at dogs, no matter how far back we go, it's dogs. When we look at bacteria, no matter what we do, they stay bugs. They don't change in their fundamental nature. There seems to be some sort of an inherent species limitation, and we have no good explanation for this in terms of Darwinian theory. We should have far more flexibility, far more plasticity under laboratory conditions than we actually do if Darwinian theory or anything like that were correct. What we see in nature, what we see in the laboratory, is very highly bounded variation, cyclic variation, as for example finch beaks in the Galapagos Island. That's about all we see. Small variations. Why is that if Darwinian theory is correct? These are evidentiary points that I think need to be stressed, need to be examined openly, honestly. And they never are.
Of course. So that was the opinion of this non-religious agnostic person. He and many others have brought up similar reasonable challenges to Darwinism, to investigate it at the theoretical, experimental, and empirical level. And yet it seems that such challenges have not been met satisfactorily. Why? Actually, in more recent times, it's seeming more likely that there is, indeed now, a way theoretically to examine the central Darwinian claim, that natural selection and random variation can account for a great deal of complexity. People like biologist Michael Behe, and geneticist John Sanford, are now focusing on this very issue. When theoretically examining this, at the most fundamental level, it seems that the Darwinian mechanism of natural selection is not creative at all, but destructive and degenerative. If crucial parts of the Darwinian theory have been contradicted by experimental evidence and discoveries of more recent times, then why has it persisted for so long? Max Planck, himself the originator of the quantum theory in physics, has said, "Science makes progress funeral by funeral. The old are never converted by the new doctrines, they simply are replaced by a new generation." A new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents eventually die, and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it. Max Planck, Scientific Autobiography, and Other Papers, Trans. F. Gaynor, New York, 1949, pages 33 to 34, 1996. Copyright 1962, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas S. Kuhn, 3rd edition. Chapter 12, The Resolutions of Revolutions, quote page 151, The University of Chicago Press, Chicago, Illinois. This reveals the sad truth about secular institutions. Perhaps a newer generation of people will be more willing to accept what proper operational science has revealed about natural law and how such repeatable and irrefutable observations contradict the Darwinian belief, so cherished by atheists. However, it does seem the controversy between creationists and atheists has been around for quite some time. But recently there have been groundbreaking realizations on how to define life, and this is proving to be a daunting problem for honest scientists. As a result, many scientists now take a more cautiously agnostic position for the sake of scientific rigor, and as is so common in the scientific fraternity, they are abandoning some of their older notions. Will this include Darwinism? Only time will tell. A common modern-day perception might be that scientists all take the atheistic position and tend not to be spiritually minded people. However, some of the most prominent scientists do present themselves as deep rational thinkers who don't ignore their doubts, and their beliefs are not based on blind credulity but instead on evidence-based faith. And many of these people have a theistic perspective, but either way, whatever their personal belief system outside the science room, they don't allow their doubts from repeatable evidence to be muted by the abstract abiogenesis fantasy within naturalistic ideology, but they take notice of the strong evidence that makes design look overwhelmingly probable when considering things like the mind-boggling integrated complexity of the most fundamental self-replicating unit of life, the cell. They, unlike some other scientists, do not blur the boundaries between proven fact and unproven belief, between proven microevolution and unproven macroevolution, or between the visible finely tuned universe with its precisely balanced laws and constants, and beliefs about what might or might not exist beyond the range of detectability. And so, these types of scientists might be some of the most spiritual and rational people alive, and therefore among the most intellectually diligent, because to them, facts have higher importance than belief systems. Even ID advocate Dr. Michael Behe, who has in the past been labeled as a theistic evolutionist, is now arguing, not only are Darwinian processes incapable of gradually building more biological complexity, but that proper rigorous science has demonstrated that only the opposite is true, namely, that Darwinian processes have only been observed to destroy complexity over time, and that such processes degenerate life, and progressively degrade genetic information, using life's reproductive and self-replicating systems. We can argue all we want about how one might hope that evolution can happen the other way, but no one has ever seen it or even thought up a computational logical pathway, and only the opposite way has been shown true, both mathematically and observationally. So, the argument in principle is falsifiable, that is to say testable, but it remains unfalsified and also has large amounts of consistently opposing verification against Darwinian beliefs, found in the regularities of physical laws and repeatable experience. Many would argue that this particular verifiable antithesis constitutes falsification of the Darwinian hypothesis. Darwinists' only means of countering this argument is to appeal to vague ideas that, when properly examined, involve improbability numbers that are ludicrously outside of what is considered to be scientifically reasonable, and therefore credulity. The laboratory evidence has shown, without exception, the macroevolution idea, involving upward change, to be in disagreement with repeatable physics. If any such process of increasing functional complexity in populations were true, surely scientists would have created a new phylum in the lab many times over by now, but the sheer fact is, they haven't even done it once, but instead what is seen is, that inbred populations below a certain size tend to degenerate, and this is consistent with modern genetics and information theory, but inconsistent with the idea of upward changes, and yet when such proper scientific objections are raised against the speculative macroevolution idea, Darwinian evolutionists religiously dismiss such scientifically valid objections, and still put forth the erroneous claim that their theory is scientific by hiding behind the unfalsifiable, ad hoc millions of years needed excuse. The famous philosopher of science, Karl Popper, who advocated the falsification principle, said, "In as far as a scientific statement speaks about reality, it must be falsifiable, and insofar as it is not falsifiable, it does not speak about reality." The Two Fundamental Problems of the Theory of Knowledge, 2014 edition, Routledge. He criticized the ideas of Sigmund Freud. He said that they were crafted in a way that made them able to refute any criticism and to give an explanation for every possible form of human behavior. The nature of such theories made it impossible for any criticism or experiment, even in principle, to show them to be false. The focus of this statement has been equally applied to Darwinism. Popper agreed with certain principles within evolution, but also acknowledged its limitations, on what it could explain, and what it could not explain. Much pressure within the mainstream caused him to recant some of his harsh criticisms of the theory. It almost seems reminiscent of what the Catholic Church did to Galileo. He referred to Darwinism as being a metaphysical idea, but useful. The theory has been criticized within the criteria of falsification. For example, Cornelius G. Hunter, formerly Senior Vice President of Seagull Technology Incorporated, in Silicon Valley, is engaged in molecular biophysics postdoctoral and engineering research in Cameron Park, California. He writes many articles for the website Evolution News. He explains how Popper tried to establish criteria for what constitutes legitimate science, the demarcation problem. But simply as a matter of practicing science, the idea of testing predictions was around long before Popper. Hunter is rigorously critical of evolutionists' non-empirical claims, what he calls, "they're just so stories," and their pseudo-scientific ad hoc excuses that they use to rescue their ideas from falsification. He says, "Being an evolutionist means there is no bad news. If new species appear abruptly in the fossil record, that just means evolution operates in spurts. If species then persist for eons with little modification, that just means evolution takes long breaks. If clever mechanisms are discovered in biology, that just means evolution is smarter than we imagined. If strikingly similar designs are found in distant species, that just means evolution sometimes introduces new designs rapidly. If no likely mechanism can be found for the large-scale change evolution requires, that just means evolution is mysterious. If adaptation responds to environmental signals, that just means evolution has more foresight than was thought. If major predictions of evolution are to be found false, that just means evolution is more complex than we thought." Cornelius Hunter, Arsenic-Based Biochemistry, Turning Poison into Wine, December 2, 2010, evolutionnews.org web link. If the demarcation for science is naturalism, then people like Dawkins who advocate that God doesn't exist, are going outside of what their philosophy of exclusive naturalism can ever define, based on what they say is scientific authority. And so they are making an invalid argument, because it is coming from outside the scope of science according to their own circular definition of the word science. And so they have contradicted themselves by going beyond their own claimed zone of constraint, by making such a claim, because the claim itself is unfalsifiable, in effect, untestable according to that very same criteria. But it would seem the most significant, fundamentally reductionist argument, and the final nail in the coffin of macroevolution belief might be the consistent observation of progressive degenerative processes in isolated populations. Even the aging process of the cells within our human bodies should give us some clue and make us question such things. You don't have to be a religious person to see the argument here. Natural laws have not been demonstrated to increase complexity, they only decrease it, over time. It follows. There are no scientific grounds for any argument by exclusion when asking the proper rational question. How then did everything begin more ordered, very far from equilibrium, and in many cases very organized, functional, complex, and irreducibly integrated? At this juncture, it is your choice to be rational and to follow the evidence wherever it leads. We have come full circle, and it may very well come down to a certain standard for scientific inquiry. What Richard P. Feynman said: it doesn't matter how beautiful your theory is, it doesn't matter how smart you are. If it doesn't agree with experiment, it's wrong. Science remains science when employing practical use of proven physics and observation. Science only becomes a religion when getting into the question of origins, specifically the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the origin of various life forms. Both evolutionists and creationists claim to be scientific. The only logical scientific distinction as to the amount of religiosity that can be made out of either argument is, when comparing the two belief systems with the second law of thermodynamics. The existence of God cannot be explained scientifically, but evolution is a lousy candidate, as the ultimate creator. But when scientifically studying the various observable processes of evolution, the experimental evidence points to a more ordered beginning, and therefore the overwhelming probability of an intelligent creator.